let's see what else. So the another week goes by without a firewall, and I'm awful sorry about that. But I get every week. I've been talking about it. I think this is the third week I've been talking about it. Uh, I have seen the rough cut of part two of this Apollo thing. It's four parts, and I didn't know it at the time, but but the final part, the part on Apollo 11, is almost 2 hours long, all scripted. Just part four is 10 firewalls worth of writing. Altogether, it's probably 36, 37, something like that. Speaking of some, Ay, she's going down by the bow. Quick to the lifeboats and run to the back. And for God's sakes, don't hold on to the flag because you cannot, no matter how hard you tread water. This is a progressive idea, I think. You can tread water as much as you want to, but if you're holding on to that flagpole at the back of the Titanic, you will not stop that ship from sinking. I got a really strong feeling that that's the case. So anyway, it's just this thing's just turning into an epic, and they are. She's breaking up. Um, uh, this is exactly like the sound on the Titanic movie, just before the ship breaks in half between the third and fourth funnels. Um, anyway, I can't. I just can't tell you how good this thing is. Uh, I mean, it's just amazing. I've shown you a few pictures of the set. I think I can show another one. Although this one may briefly have the "Hey, I'm not here. See you next week" thing. Oh, there you go. And and they're cutting in so much footage, so much footage. They're cutting in so much stuff that I didn't. Just little things like I would say, and John Glenn, clears the pad, and I'm just talking about this, and then they cut to, oh, it's okay, I don't care. The show's been off to a perfect launch, and if the thing goes too smoothly, people will panic. They will just panic. Um, okay, so but then they would cut in the actual news clip of this, which is lint on me. Um, and it's astonishingly good. Um, there are so many little moments and so many kind of backstage moments that I just managed to catch. I thought I would just basically, when I was offered the chance to do it, I just thought, okay, I'll sit down and write it, and it's a lot of writing, but just sit down and do it. And then as I started checking up on facts and stuff, I would just start following these little, um, you know, little stories. It just one little thing, and I was like, hang on, wasn't he on that? And then you just follow it out. The I'm trying to think of an example or two of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Um, Here's an interesting statistic or a little story that most people don't know. I'll just give you this little advanced cheat because it's in the show. And the show, it's going to be spectacular. I think they're talking about rolling it out now. I think part one on the 13th, two on the 15th or 17th, three on the 19th, and then four on the 20th. But it looks like, well, I'm unrecognizable in it because it's so well produced, basically. That's basically going to be your reaction. You're going to look at this thing and you're going to go, this is unbelievably great production values and everything. And who's that guy? Um, but, oh, and somebody, our friend who's been here since show one, says talk about the Midway movie coming out. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. Anyway, um, so here's the kind of example of things that I didn't know about. Uh, and this thing is just packed full of stories like this because um, this is what I think is interesting. I'm sure there's Apollo everywhere now. We're still 3 weeks out, and it's ads for everything is an Apollo 11 ad and all the rest of it. Um, So here's a little story for you. So Alan Shepard flies in Freedom 7. Shepard really wants to walk on the moon. But he's the first American in space, gets beaten by Yuri Gagarin by a couple of weeks. And so he wants to go to the moon. He develops an inner ear problem, and he's grounded for 10 years, Shepard. And he joins Deke Slayton, who was also grounded. Deke Slayton got grounded before he had a chance to fly his Mercury flight. Slayton was supposed to go after Glenn. He was supposed to do the second orbital flight on a Mercury Atlas. So Slayton, instead of who I've always felt was just like the biggest heartbreak story in the entire space program. He's one of the 7 Mercury astronauts, and everybody's taking picture of these guys everywhere, and they're all 7 of them goofing off. He's like the one guy in the boy band that got let go because of insufficient shine and body in the hair, I guess. But anyway, so Slayton, instead of just giving up, puts his life and soul into NASA and becomes the head of the astronaut program, and Shepard becomes his deputy. Now, 10 years after Freedom 7, they are working out the rotations for the Apollo crew. They've already flown a couple of Apollo missions, so I think probably Apollo 9 had just flown, 10 was on the way or about to come or something like this. And they're looking downstream for later missions. And Gordo Cooper, who was also a Mercury astronaut, who'd flown a Gemini mission, at least one, was supposed to get Apollo 13. And for reasons that remain opaque in the mists of time, Slayton pulls Cooper off of Apollo 13 and replaces him with Shepard. So now Alan Shepard's going to be the commander of Apollo 13. Cooper goes nuts, needless to say. Deke Slayton said it because he didn't think that Cooper was taking the training very seriously, and Gordo Cooper was definitely the oddball of the original 7. But just mostly out of friendship, I guess, Deke Slayton pulls Gordo Cooper off of Apollo 13 and replaces him with Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard then asks Jim McDivitt, who had commanded Apollo 9, if he would be his lunar module pilot, which means, hey, Jim, do you want to go walk on the moon, with me, first American in space? And McDivitt says, no, I'm not flying with you. I don't think you're qualified. That's pretty interesting. Shepard's reaction to that was not recorded. At least I was not able to find it. But Jim McDivitt told Shepard, I'm not flying with you. You've been on the ground for 10 years, and I don't think you're ready for a landing mission. I just don't think you've got the training for it. So now it gets even more interesting. So turns out McDivitt declines with thanks, but he's got a good point. So Deke Slayton arranges a meeting with Jim Lovell, who's commander of Apollo 14, and Slayton says, hey, Jim, how about this? How about we switch you and Shepard? You take 13, he'll take 14. You'll get to walk on the moon 3-4 months earlier. And Lovell says, fantastic, let's do it. So they switch in order to get Shepard more time to train. So now Shepard's commanding 14, Lovell's commanding 13. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out that something did go wrong on Apollo 13. They were lucky to get back alive. Jim Lovell was one of 2 people who've been to the moon twice, and he never landed. That's gotta suck. I mean, he was on Apollo 8. He knew he wasn't going to land. Then he didn't have a lunar module. That makes it definitely more difficult. But he goes to the moon, comes back, waits a couple years, then goes to the moon on Apollo 13 to take the walk on the moon. The thing blows up, flies around the moon again, back he comes. And Shepard goes on to command Apollo 14. From that point on, after Alan Shepard comes back from Apollo 14, whenever these 2 guys run into each other, which was frequently for a couple years, Lovell would do the same thing every time. He'd say, hey, Al, listen, I've been having second thoughts about switching those missions. And that's interesting. But here's where it gets even weirder. So Gordo Cooper realizes he's been put to the back of the rotation. He might be on 18 or 19. He can see the writing on the wall, and so Gordo resigns from the Air Force and NASA on the same day in 1970, I think it was at the date. So Gordo Cooper just basically storms out in disgust, understandably so. You know, you're on a moon mission. Next thing you know, you've been bumped because of what looks like favoritism, certainly what it would look like to me. And then Gordo Cooper dies. I had this written down, needless to say. I want to say it was 2004, something like that. But just because he died doesn't mean that Gordon Cooper was finished with space missions, because Gordo Cooper eventually went on to a flight where his capsule was lost in the mountains for 3 weeks. And after that, Gordo Cooper took a ride on a Falcon 1 that exploded in mid-flight. And then after that, Gordo Cooper was on board a SpaceX mission to the International Space Station. And Gordo Cooper also was vaporized on reentry into the Earth's atmosphere, which I find interesting. It turns out that on that first mission and on the last mission, he was flying with Mr. Scott. Presumably he was flight engineer, James Doohan. And it turns out that they were both members of this club that were going to have parts of their ashes put into space, and Gordo just kept try it once, nope, didn't make it, didn't get into suborbit for the release or something. Okay, gets lost in the woods for weeks. So they put him on what another little dose of him goes on to Falcon 1. It explodes in mid-flight. That's not so good. So there was a lot of ashes of Gordo Cooper, or they were hedging their bets, because they still had enough left to fly him. Doohan went up on the first one that didn't get into orbit. So Doohan and Cooper flew that first mission together. Cooper was alone when the Falcon exploded. Doohan and Cooper and something like 130 other people went up on the SpaceX first successful resupply mission, unmanned mission to the International Space Station, and their ashes were released in orbit, and they decayed probably about a month later. And tiny little meteorites, and there's parts of them up there right this second. Mr. Scott and was it J. Gordon Cooper? These kind of things to me are what makes history just incredibly interesting and fascinating. We got a bunch of them in this thing, so I'm as excited about it as I can be. And apologies for missing a couple of firewall weeks, but I'm still putting pictures into this stuff. The guys over there that are doing it are just tremendous. And there's one other thing I'll talk about real quick. Let me go back to that picture. Yeah. So basically, I do the whole thing from this incredible set. They've got 3 cameras in there. And I just basically telling the story of the space race as it looked to me. And KJ Drag is his first time live, but he's winning the internet tonight. Who is that guy? I have no idea. Some ruggedly handsome, steely-eyed missile man they found to do this kind of thing. But it was basically me just writing about the space age as it occurred to me, and as I began to realize how much work was going into it, and how much effort and how, literally cast of at least 20 people working on this thing, I began to realize that this thing is, I think, going to be actually kind of important. And I had this strange thought the other night when I was leaving after watching the first cut of part 2. It sounds a little egotistical, but that's what we've come to expect from this show. I was coming out of that edit, and I thought, this is why the eyesight went. This is why I didn't get to go to the Air Force Academy. This is why I didn't get to fly. I didn't get to fly because I was ready to fly, and I know the kind of people, and I know them personally. I know Burt Rutan and Mike Melville and a bunch of these guys, and I didn't get to actually fly because somebody had to write about it. And it's it's a strange feeling, and a really cool feeling. But I don't want to say it's a heavy burden or anything, but it's something to think about. You're basically becoming a spokesperson for this entire thing. This 10-year-old boy, is like out there half a century later, telling the story. And one of the things we talked about briefly, I don't know if this is going to happen or not. I'd like it to happen. I'd like it to happen on July 20th. It may not happen on the 20th. It may happen after that. It may not happen at all. But I would like to find the number one moon hoax guy, the number one guy who represents the fact that the landing never happened. And I would like to debate him live on the 20th of July. And I'd like to start the debate at 4:17 Eastern Time. So a lot of people are saying Owen Benjamin. We're not talking about him. He's become extremely toxic. We don't want to be seen on really the same stage as him. But I would like to find somebody who produced one of these hoax movies, and we would do it just like a structured debate. We would say, okay, you're going to get 45 minutes to make your case. Then I get 45 minutes to make my case. Then there's a 20-minute rebuttal on each side, and in between these are cross-examination sections, and then a 5-minute close. Something structured, and especially nice to have it in a room full of people, and you take a vote before the show. Who thinks we went? Raise your hand. Who thinks we didn't? Raise your hand. And who isn't sure? Raise your hand. And then we'll see how those votes go after we're done with the presentation. But I would, I would treat this like I was. I would treat this like I was on trial for my life. I wouldn't just have evidence. I'd have the kind of evidence that when people see, it's just over. And to just give you one example of this, and then we'll get on to some questions. There are many, many things that prove that we were actually on the moon, but the one that is most compelling is this. You see it from the first moment on Apollo 11 to the last moment on Apollo 17. The out-the-window footage, which we didn't see until after the crew got home, was film footage. The out-the-window footage on Apollo 11, he says, we're kicking up some dust, and it doesn't look like dust. It's not billowy. It's in Earth to the Moon. When they shot that scene, you see this billowing clouds of dust. And even on the animation that we were all watching together, there was this billowing cloud of dust, because that's what dust does, is it just rises up in a cloud. But you look at the dust on the landing out the window, and what you see is it's like somebody took a high-pressure water hose and is just squirting it straight down at concrete. It's going just blasting straight out at high speed. No dust. It's just blowing out. And that's because these very fine particles, Armstrong said it looked like talcum powder, are in a vacuum. So now it gets interesting. The kind of evidence that is overwhelming evidence is, I just saw a couple of these. You guys know what a railway car that holds like oil or liquid, right? These gigantic, enormous steel cylinders. They're incredibly strong. And at least 2 or 3 occasions, somebody has set up a contraption where they basically take a hose, attach it to the inside of this thing. Then they find some other reservoir and they pump air out of it to make a partial vacuum, as close to a vacuum as they can. Tank cars, yeah, thanks. And then they open the valve, and basically what happens is all of the air that was inside the tank rushes out of the tank, and this enormous, unbelievably strong steel structure just goes just crunch, just like you had a soda can. It just goes like that, and that's because of air pressure. And we don't feel that because we're creatures of air pressure. We live in the air. Everything we do down here is at 1 atmosphere of pressure, so it's certainly not surprising to us that if you look at a steel railroad car, it doesn't just crush itself. But when you take the air out, and the best way to think about this is imagine a sheet of tissue paper, and you just poke your finger right through it. That's when the air pressure crushes the car. When the car's not being crushed, it's because you still got the same piece of tissue paper, but you're pressing with one finger and you're pressing with the other one. You can press as hard as you want to, and that tissue paper is not going to rip because the air inside the car is equal to the air outside. So here's the thing that's really cool about the air pressure vacuum thing. And it gets backed up. I'm going to find this still. Just give me 1 second, just because you guys need to see this. And again, if we don't have a little bit of dead air, it's not really a Stratosphere Lounge. And I unbound the space bar after only a year's. Yeah, this will work. So I'm going to show you a picture here, Gangaroos. And what I'm going to show you here, and let me just move this out of the way. So what I'm going to show you is a picture of the world's largest vacuum chamber. This is the largest structure on Earth that is capable of maintaining almost a perfect vacuum on the surface. Not quite, but close. And here's what the world's largest vacuum chamber would be. And remember, if you're faking this moon landing, you got to be in a vacuum because otherwise the dust doesn't do what it does. So here's the largest one in the world. Let's make this a little bigger. There we go. Let's open for a better quality image, but it gets the point across. So here you go. You can see that this thing is surrounded by, what is that, 10 feet, 15, 20 feet of concrete, and inside this is walls of steel and all of this structure, all of the strength you see there is designed to make the area inside of a vacuum so that it doesn't collapse on itself and blow the building apart. So the point that's kind of fun to be made about this is the biggest vacuum chamber that we've ever been able to build really isn't big enough just to put the LEM in. Forget the lights and the horizon and all the rest. The biggest vacuum chamber we have is not big enough for the LEM. And not only did we, if we faked it, did we have a sound stage, just an enormous sound stage that had to be in vacuum. It does make you wonder why, if you're going to fake this whole moon landing, why you would go back 7 times, and especially why on the last 3 missions you'd put a golf cart on there. On Apollo 17, the rover was sending back real-time video, and they drove 12 miles. And every single frame, essentially, of that 12-mile drive, you can see the dust coming off of the rover, and the dust is behaving just like a jet of water, just exactly like water. And that's it. That's the end of the argument. You can't make dust do that unless you're in a vacuum. And I've had several engineers tell me it is a tougher thing to do to build a movie studio the size of the Apollo, big enough to fake the Apollo 11 moon landing. It's harder to do that than it is to go to the moon. If you're going to fake the moon landing, the easiest way to fake the moon landing is to do it on the moon. You can make these arguments all day, but the thing that wins debates is watching that oil tanker just go. It just take your breath away. It's astonishing. The pressure, air pressure. So that's one of many things. And if we can make this debate happen, I'm gonna look at every single moon landing conspiracy film I can find. and I'm going to make sure I've got an argument to make sure that I've got a response to every one of the arguments. And it's like the Loch Ness Monster, you know. It's like these two lines are diverging, so there must be more than one light source. They're diverging because it's a wide-angle lens, and I'm going to just take a regular iPhone. I'm going to take a doorway, and I'm going to stand back here and say, see how lines are parallel? Great. I'm going to walk towards it, and it's closer and closer and closer. See how they seem to bend out? There you go. And when you do things like that, where people can do this experiment on their own, there's no way to beat that. I mean, it's just, you can't beat it. If somebody's saying, well, the reason we didn't go to the moon is because these two lines are not parallel, and then you show people, well, here are the parallel lines of a doorway. Now watch, I'm not going to stop the camera, I'm just going to keep coming, watch what happens. And you see these things start to bend. Look, I know the people who are really, really into this moon landing thing, and more and more people into the flat Earth thing. I mean, really, really into it. Something really wrong with them. But most people who say they don't believe the moon landing ever happened say that because they've seen a movie, and the movie raises some compelling points. I was talking with Jeremy about this. The thing about this is, I remember I was watching Bowling for Columbine in a theater, and as I'm walking out of that theater, I'm thinking to myself, I got to admit that Michael Morbius makes some really good points. I mean, it really does some things you really do have to admit if you're a conservative, pretty trashy. And as I'm walking to the car, I start thinking about these things, and one by one, it's just like, wait a minute, that's insane, that's nuts. And your head starts to clear if you're ready to ask yourself those questions. But the point is that when you're watching a movie, you become hypnotized. And if you watch an hour and a half of people giving you facts in an entertaining way, or what appear to be facts anyway, you buy it. And I believed we were all part of this same little thing together. There was a week here on the Stratosphere Lounge when I was 100% convinced that the works of William Shakespeare were written by the Earl of Oxford. And then because I saw a tremendous documentary on it, and it just seemed like it was airtight. And then I had the intellectual honesty to go and say, okay, well, what is the pro-Shakespeare case? And when you hear the pro-Shakespeare case, it's like the things that they said means couldn't have been Will Shakespeare are just ridiculous. And then all of the evidence for Oxford is zero. And then all of the evidence for Shakespeare as Shakespeare is so overwhelming that you realize you just got suckered. I'm not saying that those people didn't believe it, but you get suckered. So anyway, it's going to be whether we get to. I'd like to do the debate regardless, because people have to put an end to this. This is like one of these things that's becoming true because it's just repeated so many times, and no one is knocking it down. And all people hear is this, and then they grow up hearing that the moon landing is a big fake, and they well, okay, that's what you grow up knowing, is that the moon landing was faked. Going into this, I knew that one of the outcomes of this series was going to be that if you had the courage and the perseverance to listen to the entire 4 hours, it turns out it's almost 5 now, you could not come away believing that the moon landing didn't happen. And the reason you couldn't believe that is because people say we faked the moon landing and no one was there. Young people who were born after the moon landing, or take an average 20-year-old in college today. Did the moon landing happen? No, it was a fake. How do you know that? Well, I saw that the lenses and the lines don't match, and they found a rock with a letter C on it, and there's a number of reasons to show that these things were fake. So I know it was faked. Now, the thing that context provides you is, if you've got a conspiracy, at what point in the deck do you insert that card? I know I'm repeating a few things I've said the last couple of weeks. It's just on my mind, and it's just interesting. Where does the conspiracy begin, and where does the conspiracy end? And here's an interesting example of that. They've got pictures now of the Apollo landing sites taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. On particularly low orbits, they actually lowered the orbit on a couple of these. And they got close enough to the surface so that every single one of the 6 landing sites, there's a very high quality image taken from lunar orbit looking down. Every single one, you can see the descent stage of the LEM, you can see all the packages, you can see the footprints, you can see the car tracks, you can see all of it. And everything is exactly where it's supposed to be and goes in the right direction for the right distances. And these lunar reconnaissance orbiter missions show pictures from all of the landing sites. Now, the conspiracy guys will say, well, that's fake as well. But here's the problem with that. If it turns out that those pictures are fake, that if they're saying that these pictures that show that show the Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 sites from orbit, if those are fake, then not only do they have the conspiracy problem of having to convince 375,000 people at NASA that this never happened, but you also have the problem now of having to maintain a conspiracy that goes from 1969 to 2019, which is 50 years, because there still have to be people who are doctoring the images coming out of the satellites. That's an awful lot of conspiracy. You know, it's just, I don't want to give the whole show away. We're going to move on. This